The scent of warm cinnamon and fresh-baked bread wafted through the small bakery on Willow Street, curling out into the cobblestone lane and tempting early morning passersby. Elena Moreno stood behind the counter, her hands deftly folding a batch of buttery dough, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had spent her entire life in a kitchen. The sunlight streaming through the wide glass windows caught the flecks of flour dusted across her apron, the streaks she'd unconsciously brushed onto her cheek, and the gentle determination in her dark brown eyes. Her bakery, Sweet Haven, had been in her family for 3 generations. Its shelves, now lined with honey-glazed croissants and perfectly browned empanadas, carried more than just pastries. They carried history. Recipes passed down from her abuela, stories whispered over simmering pots of dulce de leche, and the quiet strength of all the women who had worked tirelessly to make this place a haven for the town of Veridian. But as much as the bakery was a cornerstone of the community, Elena knew it was struggling. The quiet hum of the shop these days, compared to the bustling crowds of years past, was proof enough. Small businesses across town were feeling the weight of change. Bigger cities nearby were drawing tourists away. Flashy chain stores were creeping closer, and the traditions that once defined Veridian seemed to be slipping through their fingers. Sweet Haven was no exception. Elena had spent countless nights running the numbers, trying to stretch her savings, but the bakery's future still hung by a thread. It was the annual Veridian Food and Wine Festival that gave her hope. For years, it had been the lifeblood of the town, drawing visitors to its charming streets, tasting booths, and lively music. This year, more than ever, Elena was determined to make an impression. Her plan was simple, to showcase the recipes that had been staples of her family's menu for decades. Her abuela's alfajores, delicate and filled with creamy caramel, her mother's savory tomato and goat cheese tarts, and Elena's own twist, a lavender-infused honey cake that had quickly become a local favorite. As she placed the folded dough onto a baking sheet, the bell above the bakery door jingled. Turning around, she greeted her first customer of the day with a warm smile, one that came naturally, despite the weight pressing on her shoulders. "Morning, Mr. Bennett," she called out, already reaching for the sourdough loaf he bought every Wednesday. The elderly man tipped his hat and handed her exact change, as he always did, before thanking her with a nod and heading back out into the morning sun. It was moments like this that reminded her why she fought so hard for Sweet Haven. This bakery wasn't just hers. It belonged to the people of Veridian, to the families who gathered here after school, to the couples who shared pastries on first dates, and to the old-timers like Mr. Bennett who depended on the familiar comfort of its shelves. Losing it would be losing a piece of the town itself. As the morning wore on, the bakery began to fill with its usual visitors, mothers corralling sugar-high toddlers, teenagers grabbing coffee before class, and office workers on their way to the train station. Elena moved between them with practiced grace, greeting everyone by name, laughing at their stories, and offering samples of the day's experimental confection, a pistachio and rosewater scone that left even the skeptics reaching for seconds. By noon, the stream of customers had slowed, leaving the shop quiet once more. Elena wiped her hands on her apron and stared out the window at the festival banners fluttering in the breeze. The festival was only 2 weeks away, and though she'd been preparing for months, there was so much left to do. She needed to perfect her recipes, coordinate with her suppliers, and find a way to market her booth to the crowds. Sweet Haven couldn't afford to blend in. Not this year. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone vibrating on the counter. A text from her best friend and occasional bakery assistant, Rosa, popped up. "Lunch later? You need a break, woman. Can't have you passing out over a mixing bowl again." Elena chuckled to herself, shaking her head. Rosa wasn't wrong. Between the bakery, the festival, and the sleepless nights spent worrying over the future, she was running on fumes. But what choice did she have? Sweet Haven was her heart, her home, her legacy. She couldn't let it slip away, not without a fight. "I'll take a break when the festival's over," she muttered to herself, tying her apron tighter. Her gaze lingered on the window, on the festival banners and the cobblestones she knew so well. She would save the bakery. She had to. The train rolled into Veridian station with a low groan and a burst of steam, its polished silver cars glinting in the late afternoon sun. Mark Bennett adjusted the strap of his laptop bag on his shoulder as he stepped onto the platform, the crisp mountain air filling his lungs. The town was smaller than he'd pictured, charming in the way only places untouched by time could be. Red brick storefronts lined the main street, their hand-painted signs advertising everything from antiques to artisanal honey. Flower boxes burst with color beneath windows, and cobblestone streets curved gently around the town center, where a fountain trickled softly. Mark took it all in as he walked, his polished leather shoes clicking softly against the worn stones. He had a meeting with the festival committee in an hour, but curiosity tugged at him, and he found himself wandering toward the park, where the annual Veridian Food and Wine Festival would be held. The space was already a flurry of activity. Workers were assembling wooden booths while strings of lights crisscrossed the trees overhead. Brightly colored banners fluttered in the breeze, announcing the event in looping, hand-drawn script. As idyllic as it all looked, Mark couldn't ignore the undercurrent of urgency in the festival organizers' emails. Visitor numbers had been in decline for the past few years, and the town's economy was feeling the strain. That's where he came in. The committee had hired him to bring the festival into the digital age. Online ticketing, social media promotion, a slick new website with live updates, and vendor features. It was his specialty, finding the intersection of technology and tradition and making it sing. He'd done it for countless events in countless towns, and he was confident he could do the same for Veridian. Still, as he watched an older couple carry a stack of hand-painted signs toward the booths, he couldn't shake the feeling he was an outsider here. His tailored suit and sleek backpack felt out of place among the locals in their rolled-up sleeves and sun hats. This wasn't a city with flashing billboards and automated kiosks. It was a community rooted in its history. And while Mark believed in progress, he also knew that change, no matter how beneficial, was rarely welcomed with open arms. He ducked into a nearby cafe, the kind of place that promised a good espresso and a quiet corner to collect his thoughts. The bell above the door jingled, and the scent of freshly ground coffee wrapped around him like a warm blanket. The barista, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, greeted him with a nod. "Just passing through, or are you here for the festival?" the man asked as he prepared Mark's order. "The festival," Mark replied, offering a faint smile. "I'm working with the committee to modernize things a bit." The barista arched a brow. "Modernize, huh? Does that mean QR codes and apps instead of a good old paper map?" Mark chuckled. "Something like that, though we're trying to keep the spirit of the event intact." "That spirit is what keeps this town alive, you know," the man said, sliding a mug across the counter. "People come here for the charm, the tradition. If you take that away, it's just another festival." Mark nodded thoughtfully, sipping the rich, dark coffee as he took a seat by the window. He'd heard similar sentiments in other towns, but there was a weight to the barista's words here. Veridian wasn't just holding on to its traditions, it was clinging to them like a lifeline. His laptop whirred to life as he opened it, fingers flying over the keys as he reviewed his notes for the evening meeting. The festival had the potential to be something extraordinary, but it needed a new angle to draw the crowds. Online marketing could expand its reach far beyond the town limits, and interactive features could appeal to younger audiences. He could already envision the analytics dashboards, the targeted ad campaigns, the surge of ticket sales. But as he glanced out the window, at the cobblestones, the hand-painted signs, the workers laughing as they strung up lights, he wondered if the town would see it the same way. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of his phone. A text from his assistant popped up. "Meeting at 5 sharp. Don't charm them too much. They might think you're one of them." Mark smirked, shaking his head as he shut his laptop and finished his coffee. As he left the cafe and headed toward the town hall, Mark felt the weight of what lay ahead. He wanted to believe that tradition and technology could coexist harmoniously, but he'd met enough resistance in his career to know it wouldn't be easy. And in a place like Veridian, where every cobblestone seemed to whisper a story of the past, he suspected the road ahead would be rockier than most. The cafe on the corner of Main and Vine was one of Elena's favorite places in town. It had the kind of character that couldn't be manufactured: worn wooden floors, mismatched chairs, and a chalkboard menu that listed the daily specials in looping handwriting. The air always seemed to smell of freshly brewed coffee and vanilla, and the soft hum of conversation was a comforting background melody. She had planned to grab a quick latte and a slice of lemon tart before heading back to the bakery, but Rosa's insistence on her taking a break had turned into a rare moment of indulgence. Now, Elena sat at a small corner table with her coffee steaming beside her, flipping through a cookbook she'd brought along for inspiration. The photos of intricate pastries and delicate glazes made her mouth water, and she found herself mentally reworking recipes to include local ingredients. The door jingled, drawing her attention briefly as another customer walked in. He was tall, with sandy brown hair that caught the sunlight streaming through the window. His gray button-down was neatly pressed, but his tie was slightly loosened, as if he was trying to strike a balance between professionalism and comfort. He looked not from here. Not in a bad way, but in the way someone looked when they were passing through, just brushing the edges of Veridian's quiet rhythm. He scanned the cafe, his gaze landing on the counter. Approaching it, he smiled politely at the barista and placed his order. Elena tried to focus on her book, but out of the corner of her eye, she noticed him patting his pockets, a faint furrow appearing between his brows. He checked his laptop bag next, then his jacket, a growing look of mild panic on his face. "Everything all right, Mark?" the barista Joe asked with a touch of familiarity. Mark, so he wasn't just passing through, Elena thought. Or at least, not completely. Not exactly, Mark admitted, his voice low and a little sheepish. He pulled his wallet from his back pocket, or at least what he thought was his wallet. It turned out to be a slim black phone charger, which he placed back with an awkward laugh. "I think I left my wallet at somewhere that isn't here." Joe chuckled. "Don't worry about it. You're good for it later." But Mark shook his head, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. "No, really, I'll figure it out. I don't want to be that guy." Elena, unable to resist, shut her book and rose from her seat. "I've got it," she said, surprising even herself as she stepped toward the counter. Both men turned to her, and Mark's expression shifted from embarrassment to gratitude in a heartbeat. "You don't have to do that," Mark said quickly, his hand lifting in protest. His smile was warm, though, a little apologetic, a little grateful. "I can just come back later." "It's no big deal," Elena replied with an easy shrug. "Consider it a welcome to Veridian, or at least a we're pretty nice here moment." She glanced at Joe. "What's his order?" "A black coffee and a blueberry scone," Joe supplied helpfully. "Scone and coffee it is." Elena handed over a few bills, waving off Mark's protest before he could really get going. She turned back to him with a teasing smile. "You can pay me back by not making it a habit." Mark laughed, a sound that was warm and genuine. "Deal. Thank you." "Elena," she offered, "and you're Mark, if I heard Joe right." "Guilty," he said, holding out a hand. "Mark Bennett, and I owe you one, Elena." She shook his hand, surprised at the steadiness of his grip, the way his smile seemed to settle into the edges of his face, like it belonged there. "Don't worry about it. It happens to the best of us." "Not usually to me," he admitted, stepping aside so she could grab her own coffee from the counter. He gestured toward her table. "Mind if I join you? I'm pretty sure I owe you at least some polite conversation in return for the rescue." Elena hesitated for a moment. She had come here to get away from work, but something about Mark's expression, the way he seemed genuinely interested and not just filling time, made her nod. "Sure, have a seat." They returned to her table, and for the next half hour, conversation flowed easily between them. Mark asked her what she did, and she told him about the bakery, about her family's recipes and her obsession with perfecting them. He, in turn, shared stories about his work, something to do with cybersecurity, though he was vague about the specifics. It was clear he was good at what he did, but he talked about it with a kind of self-deprecating humor that made Elena laugh. "So," Mark said, picking up the last crumb of his scone, "what's the secret to a perfect blueberry scone? I feel like I should ask an expert." Elena smiled, resting her chin on her hand. "Cold butter, always, and don't overwork the dough. The second you start fussing with it too much, you're doomed." "Noted," Mark said, looking genuinely impressed. But I'll admit, I'm more of an eater than a baker. That's all right, Elena teased. It's less messy that way. Their laughter mingled, easy and warm. Neither of them noticed the time until Elena glanced at the clock on the wall and groaned. I should get back to the bakery, Mark nodded, finishing off his coffee. And I've got a meeting to get to. He paused, then added with a smile, Thanks again for saving me. I'll swing by the bakery to pay you back, and maybe grab one of those cold butter-approved scones. Anytime, Elena said lightly, gathering her things. As she stepped out into the sunlight, she glanced back at the cafe and found herself smiling. It had been a long time since she'd enjoyed a conversation like that. And she had no idea what kind of storm was waiting just around the corner. The warm buzz of the bakery had Elena feeling lighter than she had in days. The morning rush had tapered off, leaving her a few precious moments to breathe. Sunlight streamed through Sweet Haven's large windows, casting golden light onto the quiet shop. She was kneeling behind the counter to organize a box of handwritten recipe cards when the bell over the door jingled. Be right with you, she called, standing and brushing flour from her hands as she rose. Her smile was already in place when she turned toward the door, but it faltered slightly when she saw who had entered. Mark stood there, looking every bit as polished as he had at the cafe. Today, he wore a crisp navy shirt and dark jeans, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. His sandy hair was slightly tousled, and his easy smile brightened the space. Elena, he greeted, his tone warm, as though the two of them had been confidants for years rather than sharing coffee once. I finally made it by. Thought I'd grab one of those famous cold butter-approved scones. For a moment, Elena's heart lifted at the sight of him, but then reality came crashing back. She hadn't made the connection at first, but Rosa had mentioned him during lunch just yesterday. Mark Bennett, the outsider brought in for the festival's overhaul. The man spearheading the shiny new digital ticketing system and flashy online marketing campaign, her stomach twisted. Mark Bennett, she said slowly, her tone carefully even. So, you're the guy the festival committee brought in. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. Guilty. I take it you've heard about me. Something like that, she replied, crossing her arms over her flour-dusted apron. A part of her wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, but the thought of someone like him, outsider, corporate-minded, tech-savvy, changing the fabric of Veridian's most cherished event made her chest tighten. Modernizing the festival, right? Mark's smile faltered a fraction, but he nodded. That's the plan. Online ticketing, a new website, targeted ads, stuff to help pull in a bigger crowd. It's worked in other towns I've worked with. I think it could really... Change everything? Elena interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. Turn the festival into some cookie-cutter event you could see in any city? Lose everything that makes it unique? Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to help the festival, help the town thrive again. By throwing out tradition, she pressed. By replacing the way we've always done things with, she gestured vaguely, trying to find the words, with QR codes and algorithms? His expression shifted, the warmth in his eyes cooling slightly. I'm not throwing anything out, Elena. I'm trying to preserve what makes this place special, while giving it a fighting chance to survive. You think I don't see how much this town cares about its history? About its charm? He gestured to the bakery, to the cobblestones visible just outside the window. I see it. That's what makes places like Veridian worth saving. Saving? Elena repeated, her voice rising. We don't need saving. What we need is for people to respect what's already here, what's already working. Is it working, though? Mark countered, his tone firm but not unkind. Because from what I've learned, the festival attendance has been dropping for years. Businesses are struggling. Visitors aren't coming back. You think I want to bulldoze over tradition, but that's not it. I'm trying to draw people here so they can experience that tradition. If they don't come, what happens to the festival? To places like this bakery? The words hit a nerve, and Elena took a step back, her jaw tightening. She didn't need him pointing out the obvious. She didn't need a stranger telling her what was at stake when it was her life and her family's legacy on the line. You don't understand, she said quietly. but there was steel in her voice. This town isn't just some project for you to fix. It's not numbers on a spreadsheet or a marketing strategy. It's people, it's history, it's... She trailed off, searching for the right words. It's home. Mark exhaled, running a hand through his hair. And you think I don't get that? I'm not some faceless corporation coming in to buy up your bakery, Elena. I'm here to help. And whether you like it or not, change is coming. All I'm trying to do is make sure it's the kind of change that keeps this town alive. By replacing everything we've built, she shot back, the heat in her voice unmistakable now. I'm not replacing anything, he said firmly, his voice rising to meet hers. I'm trying to make sure there's still something here 10 years from now. They stared at each other for a long moment, the air between them charged with tension. Elena's heart thudded in her chest as she tried to make sense of her emotions. She hated the way his words made sense, even as they rubbed her the wrong way. She hated that he wasn't entirely wrong, and that she couldn't tell if he actually cared or if he was just another outsider playing the role of savior. Mark broke the silence first, the frustration in his expression softening slightly. Look, he said, his tone quieter now. I get that you're protective of this town. I respect that. But maybe instead of fighting me on this, you could try meeting me halfway. We both want the same thing, Elena. We just have different ways of getting there. Elena drew in a slow breath, her arms still crossed, the stubborn set of her jaw unwavering. You think you know what I want, she said coolly, but you don't. And until you do, maybe you should focus on your numbers and leave the heart of this town to the people who actually live here. Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gave a small nod, his lips pressing into a thin line. Fair enough, he said simply, slinging his bag over his shoulder. Thanks for the scone. And with that, he turned and walked out the door, the bell jingling faintly in his wake. Elena watched him go, her heart pounding and her emotions tangled. She hated how conflicted she felt, how his words lingered in her mind. She turned back to her counter, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the next batch of dough to knead. But no matter how hard she tried to focus, she couldn't shake the image of Mark's retreating figure, or the uncomfortable truth that he wasn't entirely the enemy she wanted him to be. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows of Sweet Haven, painting the walls in shades of honey and gold. Outside, the familiar sounds of Veridian drifted in, the rattle of a passing bicycle, the distant bark of a dog, and the faint hum of conversation from the nearby cafe. Elena stood at the counter, her hands busy piping intricate swirls of buttercream onto a tray of lavender cupcakes, but her mind was far from her work. Rosa had been the one to tell her. She'd stopped by earlier, her expression grave, her voice lowered as the words spilled out. I heard it from Marco at the wine shop, Rosa had said, leaning in close. He says Mark, your friend from the festival, is working with some big corporation. Supposedly, they're planning to buy out a bunch of local businesses. The bakery's on the list, Elena. At the time, Elena had laughed it off, brushing powdered sugar from her hands as if shaking off the weight of it. That doesn't make sense, she'd replied. Mark's annoying, sure, but he's not some corporate spy. But Rosa's response had made her pause. Maybe, but people are talking, Elena, and you know what they're saying? That he's just here to pave the way for these big changes, that all this modernization nonsense is step one. Now, hours later, the words still sat heavy in her chest. She didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it. After all, Mark had seemed genuine, arrogant maybe, but not malicious. Still, the thought gnawed at her, fueled by her own doubts about him and the tension simmering between them since their argument. The bell above the bakery door chimed, and Elena looked up sharply. Speak of the devil. Mark stepped inside, looking impossibly polished as usual in a crisp white shirt and a dark blazer, his laptop bag slung over one shoulder. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on her, and he offered a smile that she didn't return. Elena, he greeted, his tone warm but cautious as he approached the counter. Busy as always, I see. What do you want, Mark? She asked. Her voice clipped as she set the piping bag down. The coldness in her tone clearly caught him off guard. His smile faltered, and he tilted his head slightly, studying her. I came to check in. The festival's coming up fast, and I wanted to make sure your booth setup is good to go. Thought maybe you'd need help with the tech." "I don't need your help," Elena cut in sharply. She stepped out from behind the counter, crossing her arms as she faced him. Her voice was steady, but beneath it was a tremor of anger she couldn't suppress. "But maybe you can help with something else." Mark frowned, his brows drawing together. "Okay, what's going on?" "Is it true?" she demanded, her gaze fixed on him. "Are you working with some big corporation? Are they planning to buy up businesses here in town? My bakery included?" Mark blinked, clearly blindsided by the accusation. "What? No, of course not. Where is this coming from?" Elena narrowed her eyes, taking a step closer. "Don't play dumb, Mark. People are talking. They're saying that this whole modernization thing is just a cover, that you're here to help sell us all out." "That's not true," Mark said firmly, his voice rising slightly. "I don't know who's saying that, but it's not true. I would never do something like that." "Wouldn't you?" she challenged. "You don't even live here. You don't have to deal with the consequences of the changes you're pushing. You just get to swoop in, make your plans, and leave while the rest of us clean up the mess." His jaw tightened, and for the first time his frustration broke through the calm veneer. "You're seriously accusing me of this? After everything I've done to try to help this town? To help you?" "Help me?" Elena let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You're not helping me, Mark. You're tearing this town apart." Mark took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "Elena, listen to me. I don't know who started these rumors, but they're just that. Rumors. I'm not working for any corporation, and I'm not trying to hurt your bakery or anyone else's." "Then why are people saying it?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why would this even come up if it wasn't true?" "I don't know," Mark shot back, his frustration boiling over. "Maybe because people are scared of change. Maybe because they don't understand what I'm trying to do. But that doesn't make it true, and it doesn't give you the right to treat me like the enemy." Elena stared at him, her chest heaving as her anger clashed with the flicker of doubt in her mind. She wanted to believe him, she really did, but the uncertainty rooted itself too deeply. "You expect me to just take your word for it?" she asked, her voice quieter now but no less sharp. "After everything? After you've done nothing but push changes that go against everything this town stands for?" Mark opened his mouth to respond, but then closed it again, his expression darkening. Finally he spoke, his voice low and strained. "I don't know what else to say, Elena. I'm telling you the truth. If you can't see that," he trailed off, shaking his head, "then maybe you don't know me as well as I thought you did." "Maybe I don't," she said quietly, the words landing like a stone between them. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Mark looked at her for a long moment, his jaw tight and his eyes hard, before he turned and walked toward the door. The bell jingled as he pushed it open, and then he was gone, leaving Elena standing alone in the golden light of the bakery, her hands trembling and her heart aching with the weight of everything unsaid. The hum of Mark's laptop filled the quiet of his makeshift workspace in the corner of his rented cottage. The warm glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the stack of papers scattered around him, festival maps, vendor contracts, email printouts. A mug of coffee, now lukewarm, sat untouched beside him. His jaw was tight, his shoulders tense, but his fingers flew over the keyboard. He wasn't letting this go. The accusations from Elena earlier that day still rang in his ears, the anger in her voice, the way she'd looked at him like he was some villain sent to destroy everything she cared about. It gnawed at him. He didn't blame her for her frustration. He understood where it was coming from. But it wasn't fair. He wasn't the bad guy here. And now, more than ever, he was determined to prove it. "Let's see who really benefits from these rumors," he muttered under his breath, leaning closer to the screen. Mark had started with the basics. Who was spreading the whispers about him? What motive did they have? The timing of the rumors felt too deliberate to be coincidence. Everything had been moving forward smoothly, albeit with some resistance, until the past week. Vendors were suddenly pulling out, sponsors were hesitating, and now Elena, one of the town's most respected voices, was questioning his integrity. It was sabotage, plain and simple. But by whom? He sifted through his emails again, rereading communications with the festival committee and cross-referencing the vendor list. One name kept popping up more than the others: Green Valley Group. They owned a handful of upscale restaurants and wineries just outside Veridian, and they'd been angling for booth space at the festival for years. Mark had dismissed their initial pitch. Too corporate, too polished, the opposite of what made Veridian's festival special. The committee had agreed, opting to keep the focus on local businesses. But now, as Mark dug deeper, a pattern emerged. A few keystrokes brought up a press release from last year. Green Valley had hosted a competing food and wine event just a week after Veridian's festival, luring away a significant number of attendees. Their marketing had been aggressive, boasting about elevating the region's culinary scene. Mark clenched his jaw as he read. It wasn't enough that they'd tried to overshadow the festival. Now, it seemed they were trying to undermine it from within. He opened a new tab and began searching social media. Sure enough, several posts from accounts linked to Green Valley were subtly planting seeds of doubt about Veridian's festival. One post read, "Why settle for old-fashioned when you can have sophistication? See you at Green Valley's Harvest Gala this October." Another implied that the town's festival was struggling to keep up with modern standards. Mark's stomach churned as the dots connected. They weren't just marketing their own event. They were actively trying to tarnish Veridian's reputation. The final piece of the puzzle came from a vendor's email he'd flagged earlier in the week. One of the festival's key participants, a local cheese shop, had suddenly withdrawn, citing concerns about corporate interference. At the time, Mark had chalked it up to miscommunication, but now he pulled up the email chain and noticed something he'd missed before. The vendor mentioned speaking with a representative who claimed to be affiliated with the festival, someone who warned them about the risks of participating this year. Mark's blood ran cold. Whoever this so-called representative was, they weren't working for the festival. They were working for Green Valley. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he processed the information. It was clear now. Green Valley was behind the rumors, the withdrawals, the growing mistrust. They wanted Veridian's festival to fail so they could swoop in and dominate the region's food scene. And in the process, they'd painted a target on Mark's back, using him as the scapegoat to stir up doubt among the locals. Mark's thoughts turned to Elena. She deserved to know the truth. More than that, she deserved an apology. While he wasn't at fault for the rumors, he hadn't done enough to stop them sooner. He'd been so focused on his plans for the festival that he hadn't taken the time to listen to see how deeply the changes were affecting people like her. And now, because of his inaction, she'd been caught in the crossfire. He closed his laptop, grabbed his phone, and scrolled to her number. He hesitated before pressing call, knowing she might not even pick up. After their confrontation, he wouldn't blame her. But this couldn't wait. The phone rang twice before it went to voicemail. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Elena, it's Mark," he said after the beep. His voice was steady, but there was a softness to it that hadn't been there before. "I know you're upset, and I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from right now, but I need you to trust me on this. The rumors, they're not true. I've found proof that someone else is behind them, and I think you'll want to see it. I'll be at the cafe tomorrow morning if you want to talk. Please, Elena, this is important." He hung up and set the phone down, leaning back in his chair. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready to face it. If there was one thing he'd learned about Elena, it was that she wouldn't back down from a fight. And neither would he, not when so much was at stake. The cafe on the corner of Main and Vine was bathed in the soft morning light, golden rays streaming through the wide windows and casting gentle shadows on the mismatched tables and chairs. It was quiet this early. A few locals lingered over their coffee, murmuring in low voices, while Joe moved behind the counter with his usual easy rhythm. Mark sat at a table near the window, his laptop bag at his feet and a steaming cup of black coffee in his hands. He had been there for nearly 30 minutes, his eyes flicking toward the door every time the bell jingled, his expression a careful mix of hope and apprehension. When it finally opened and Elena stepped in, he straightened in his chair, his fingers tightening slightly around the mug. She looked wary, Her arms crossed over her chest as her gaze swept the room and landed on him. For a moment, she hesitated, as if debating whether to turn around and leave. But then she squared her shoulders and walked toward him, her boots clicking softly against the worn wooden floor. "Elena," Mark said, standing as she approached. He managed a tentative smile, but it was clear he was bracing himself for whatever came next. "Thanks for coming." She nodded curtly, but didn't return his smile. "You said it was important." "It is," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please sit." Elena hesitated again, but finally pulled out the chair and sat, her posture tense, her eyes sharp as they fixed on him. "You've got 5 minutes," she said coolly, though there was a flicker of curiosity beneath her guarded tone. "Make it count." Mark exhaled, setting his coffee down and pulling a folder from his bag. "I need to start by saying I'm sorry," he said, his voice steady but earnest. "Not for something I've done, but for everything you've been dealing with because of me. I know the rumors have made it seem like I'm here to hurt this town, and I hate that it's caused you so much stress. But I promise you, Elena, it's not true, and I can prove it." He opened the folder and slid a few printed documents across the table toward her. Elena glanced down at them, her brows furrowing as she scanned the pages. "What is this?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "Evidence," Mark said. "Those rumors about me working with a corporation to buy out businesses? They didn't start on their own. They were planted, intentionally, by a group called Green Valley. They run a competing food and wine event just outside town, and they've been trying to undermine Veridian's festival for years. When I started digging, I found social media posts, fake accounts, and even vendors who've been approached with false information about the festival." Elena's eyes narrowed as she flipped through the pages, her gaze lingering on screenshots of suspicious posts and email exchanges. "Green Valley?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "Why would they care about Veridian's festival?" "Because it's in their way," Mark explained. "They want to dominate the region's food and wine scene, and Veridian's festival, with its history and charm, is their biggest competition. They've already tried hosting their own events to draw people away, but now they're taking it a step further, spreading lies to make the town turn on itself." Elena leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing again as she studied him. "And you're saying you had nothing to do with this?" "I swear to you I didn't," Mark said, his voice firm but sincere. "I've been working with the festival committee to help bring in more visitors, not drive them away. This town's traditions, they're what make the festival special. I'd never do anything to destroy that." For a long moment, Elena said nothing. She looked down at the papers again, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges. Mark watched her carefully, his heart pounding as he waited for her to speak. Finally, she let out a soft sigh and looked up at him, her expression softer than it had been when she walked in. "It's a lot to take in," she admitted. "But if what you're saying is true, then Green Valley's the real problem, not you." Relief flickered across Mark's face, and he nodded. "Exactly. And I can't take them down alone. That's why I wanted to talk to you. I need your help, Elena. The festival needs your help." Elena arched a brow, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "You need my help?" "I do," he said, his smile growing in response to hers. "You understand this town better than anyone. You know what makes it special, what draws people here. If we work together, we can make sure the festival stays true to its roots while still bringing in the kind of attention it needs to survive. Tradition and innovation, they don't have to be enemies." Elena studied him for a moment, her gaze searching his face. Then she let out another sigh, this one tinged with resignation. "You're a pain in the ass, you know that?" Mark chuckled, the tension between them easing. "I've been told." Shaking her head, Elena reached for her coffee and took a sip. "All right," she said finally. "I'll help, but only because I care about this town, and because I think you might actually care too." Mark's smile widened, and for the first time in days he felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you, Elena," he said. "I promise you won't regret this." "We'll see," she said, but her tone was lighter now, the guarded edge in her voice fading. "Just don't expect me to go easy on you." "I wouldn't dream of it," Mark replied, his grin turning playful. As the cafe buzzed softly around them, they leaned over the table together, their heads close, as they began to map out a plan to save the festival. a plan that honored the heart of Veridian while embracing a future they could shape together. The night sky above Veridian was alive with the glow of 1,000 lights. Strings of twinkling bulbs crisscrossed the festival grounds, their golden warmth casting a soft, ethereal glow over the cobblestone streets of the town square. Booths lined the square and adjacent park, adorned with colorful banners and the unmistakable charm of handwritten signs touting everything from honey lavender cakes to small batch wines. The air was heavy with the mingling scents of fresh pastries, grilled meats, and sweet mulled wine, and everywhere laughter and music wove together in a joyful symphony. Elena stood at her booth, her hands dusted with a faint trace of powdered sugar, her heart light in a way she hadn't felt in years. It was nearly impossible to believe, but Sweet Haven's pastries were the talk of the festival. Lines had wrapped around her booth for most of the day, with visitors clamoring for her abuela's alfajores, her mother's savory tomato and goat cheese tarts, and her own lavender cake that had become a local legend. She'd lost count of how many batches she'd sold, and still, people kept coming, their faces alight with delight and gratitude. She looked out across the crowd, watching families share laughter over plates of food, couples stealing bites from one another's desserts, and children chasing one another with sticky fingers and sugar-dusted smiles. This was what she'd fought so hard for, the soul of Veridian alive and thriving, its traditions holding strong in the face of change. "Elena!" Rosa's voice cut through the hum of the crowd, and Elena turned to see her best friend weaving her way through the throng. Rosa held 2 glasses of sparkling cider, one of which she handed to Elena with a wide grin. "To Sweet Haven's grand triumph," Rosa declared, lifting her glass in a toast. Elena laughed, her smile so wide it felt like it might split her face. "To Veridian," she replied, clinking her glass against Rosa's. For a moment, the 2 women stood in companionable silence, taking in the scene before them. "Looks like the whole town showed up tonight," Rosa said, nudging Elena gently. Her gaze shifted and she smirked. "And speaking of showing up..." Elena followed Rosa's line of sight, her breath catching slightly as she spotted Mark standing a few yards away. He was talking to a group of festival committee members, his hands animated as he gestured toward one of the booths. He looked different tonight, less polished, more at home. His usual crisp button-down had been traded for a simple dark sweater, the sleeves pushed up to reveal his forearms, and his sandy hair was slightly tousled as if he'd been running his hands through it all evening. But it was his smile, the warm, genuine one that reached his eyes, that caught her attention and held it. "He's been looking over here all night," Rosa said, her smirk deepening. "Pretty sure he's just waiting for his moment." Elena shook her head, though she couldn't stop the blush that warmed her cheeks. "Go find your own drama," she teased, giving Rosa a gentle shove. Rosa winked. "I think I just did." With that, she melted back into the crowd, leaving Elena standing alone with her thoughts. She was still holding her glass of cider when Mark finally made his way over. She noticed the way the crowd seemed to part for him, a testament to how seamlessly he'd managed to integrate himself into their once skeptical community. He stopped a few feet away, his smile softening as their eyes met. "Busy night?" he asked, his voice warm and familiar, carrying easily over the din of the festival. "You could say that," Elena replied, setting her glass down on the counter. "I think I've sold more pastries tonight than I did all of last month." "Guess that means I'm not the only one who thinks your lavender cake is life-changing," Mark said, his grin turning playful. Elena laughed, rolling her eyes. "I don't think I'll ever hear the end of that." "Probably not," he admitted, taking a small step closer. "But you should know it's true, just like everything you've done here tonight." He gestured to her booth, to the bustling festival around them. "This is incredible, Elena. You're incredible." She felt her cheeks flush again, but this time she didn't try to hide it. "It wasn't just me," she said, meeting his gaze. "You had a lot to do with it." Mark shrugged modestly, though there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Maybe, but this festival, this town, it's got heart because of people like you. I just helped shine a light on it." They stood there for a moment, the noise of the festival fading into the background as the weight of everything unspoken hung between them. Elena's heart pounded, her chest tight with the realization of how much had shifted between them, how much she didn't want to ignore anymore. "Mark," she began, her voice quieter now, more vulnerable. "I know I've been difficult, and I know I haven't always made things easy for you. But," she hesitated, searching for the right words, "I see now what you've been trying to do, and thank you, for everything." Mark's expression softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against hers where it rested on the counter. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice equally quiet. "I only wanted to help. And maybe I wanted to prove to you that I wasn't the bad guy you thought I was." "You've more than proven it," Elena said, her lips curving into a small smile. They stood like that for a moment longer, the rest of the world falling away. And then, as if drawn by some invisible pull, Mark leaned in and Elena met him halfway. The kiss was soft and unhurried, a silent promise wrapped in warmth and understanding. When they pulled back, their foreheads rested together, their smiles mirrored. "Guess this means you don't hate me anymore," Mark teased lightly, his voice tinged with humor. Elena laughed softly, her eyes shining. "Not even a little?" The sounds of the festival swirled around them as they stood together, their hearts full, their future just beginning. Tradition and innovation, love and partnership, it was all possible. They could see it now, as clearly as the lights that twinkled above them. The late afternoon sun bathed the garden in a golden hue, its rays dancing across the rows of blossoming lavender and neatly tended vegetable patches. From the porch of the old house, its white paint weathered but charming, Elena could hear the sound of laughter ringing out, clear and bright, as her grandchildren darted between the rows of flowers, their small hands brushing against the fragrant stalks. One of them let out a squeal of delight as the family dog, a shaggy mutt named Biscuit, bounded after them, tail wagging furiously. Elena leaned back in her rocking chair, a mug of chamomile tea warming her hands. Beside her, Mark sat with his feet propped up on the porch railing, the easy creak of his chair in rhythm with her own. His hair had gone grayer over the years, though it still caught the sunlight in the same sandy streaks she remembered from their first meeting. The lines around his eyes had deepened, but so had his smile. And when he turned to look at her, she still felt that same quiet warmth she had all those years ago in the cafe. "They're going to trample my lavender," Elena said, though her tone carried no real admonishment. Mark chuckled, his gaze following the children's chaotic paths. "It's resilient, like you," he said lightly, reaching over to rest his hand atop hers. His touch was steady, grounding. "Besides, I think the lavender can handle a little joy." Elena smiled, shaking her head. "You always know how to get away with things." "Not always," he teased, his grin widening. "Remember when I suggested adding QR codes to the bakery for online orders? I thought you were going to throw a pie at me." "I should have," she shot back, laughing quietly. "But look at you now, my digital innovator." "And look at you," Mark said, his voice softening. "The heart of this family, just like you were the heart of Veridian." She glanced at him, her expression tender. "We both built this, Mark. The bakery, the festival, the life we've made here. None of this would have been possible without you." He squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I think we just brought out the best in each other." The breeze carried the sound of their grandchildren's laughter back to them, and they fell into a comfortable silence, watching as the next generation played in the garden they had nurtured together. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, and Elena leaned her head against Mark's shoulder. Their journey had been anything but easy, but as they sat surrounded by love and the echoes of their shared past, it was clear it had all been worth it.